Big question. What does it mean to be human? And what does it mean when we start to internalize our own dehumanization? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. This is our read-through of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is Chapter 1. We're covering all of Chapter 1 today, which is laying the groundwork for what's to come, and it's basically making one big argument. And that argument is that if our goal, our driving goal in all of this is humanization, then education needs to come from the bottom up. It cannot come from the top down. That is to say that education needs to come from people and communities themselves. Normally, I like to split these videos up into different sections, but this is one of those that is just gonna kind of be a bit of a free-ranging discussion around these themes, just because there's a lot to talk through and there's no clear way to really split it all up. But before we dig in, I do want to give a huge thank you to all the subscribers over there on Patreon. It is really, really cool that you're there. Your support helps make this whole thing possible. It helps me keep this main feed book reading series stuff free for everybody who wants it. It's really important for me that this information be available just to anybody who's reading these books, who's interested in engaging with this stuff. So your support, it really, really means the world. Thank you so much. And if you're watching this on YouTube, do consider heading over to Patreon and subscribing. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. And of course, there is a free tier over there just if you want to watch these videos and engage with the comments, stuff like that. And of course, please don't forget to comment, subscribe, tell your friends, all that good stuff. But let's talk Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed for a little bit. Because in this chapter, we are starting with some absolute basics. We're building a foundation before Freire starts to tell us the process of investigation and the creation of generative themes and all of this stuff that's going to go into his method for the pedagogy of the oppressed. He's going to give us some fundamentals before we get to that first. Freire is not even going to give us the banking concept of education, something we discussed in the intro lecture. That's going to come actually in chapter 2. For now, we're talking literally about what it means to be human. And that, of course, is a deeply complex question. It is a question that philosophers have wrestled with throughout recorded history and probably since the dawn of humankind. We've always kind of been asking ourselves this question. What is it that truly makes us human? If you are watching this video, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you are probably human. Even if you are an AI from the future watching this, please, of course, think kindly of us. But I'm guessing that everybody involved in this, we're all human. Biologically, that is, right? Biologically, our cells, our DNA are such that we can call ourselves humans in most of the important ways. But humans are somewhat unique among the species on planet Earth for the very fact that we are able to ask ourselves this question, what does it mean to be human? This is an argument, actually, if you followed along with the Murray Bookchin series that I did last year. Murray Bookchin also talks about this idea, right? And none of this is to underplay the fact that animals are absolutely capable of complex thoughts and emotions. Absolutely they are. My dog, for example, right now is experiencing the emotion of boredom and waiting for me to finish up recording this video so that we can go and tug with his tug that he really likes to play with. But humans, as far as we know, we are the only species that spends any real amount of time reflecting on the nature of the human race and our place here in the cosmos. And that led Murray Bookchin, the anarchist who by the end of his life was not calling himself an anarchist philosopher, to make the argument that humans are therefore of nature and somewhat apart from nature. He makes this distinction between first nature and second nature, nature as kind of human culture. And that has some fascinating implications for ecology, But what about just existence? Because we really need to wrestle with this question of what is humanity if we want to talk, like Freire wants to talk, about humanization. If you go to work every day in an Amazon warehouse with your every second monitored with a wrist tracker, you are paid a small wage with the fruits of your labors going to somebody else, is that humanity? We would probably say no. We'd probably say that actually feels like kind of the opposite. That feels mechanical. That feels like you've become a robot, that you're just sort of a cog in a machine here. You are struggling in a very mechanized way to do things for other people who are in the process of oppressing you. And so as we think through this thought experiment, we get this dichotomy that has kind of always existed for us, right? This distinction between man and machine. Something that is human is something that is not mechana. And here's the thing, and it's a potential issue with this particular chapter. Paulo Freire doesn't give us a clear statement about what exactly humanity requires to be human. But the implication of this first chapter, which we sort of have to read into it, is that this vision of humanity and humanization that Freire is presenting us with requires freedom and meaning. Two things that the mechanized or the oppressed or the exploited body doesn't have. Humans are, at the end of the day, pretty messy, right? They bop around, they fall in love, they make a lot of really bad art and sometimes occasionally very good art. They talk, they laugh, they fight, they make friends, they work, and sometimes they work, and by that work they understand themselves as capable, as significant, as having meaning. We've talked about that Amazon warehouse. Instead of that Amazon warehouse, let's take the example of a person who raises chickens. Now, that is hard work. Trust me, chickens absolutely suck. But those eggs that the chickens are laying are going to potentially neighbors. They're going to members of the community. They're going to friends and family who will go on to eat those eggs and sustain themselves and sometimes really enjoy those eggs. And you can see the fruits of your labor, in this case, meaning something. And of course, this is a very specific vision of a chicken farmer. There are, of course, industrial-sized chicken farmers. We're not really talking about those. We're talking about something a lot more scaled down, a lot more personal. This is sort of a humanized version of this kind of work. And when we compare these two examples, the one in the Amazon warehouse and the one in this very scaled down kind of chicken coop farmer, you start to see that humanity isn't really about work. You're working in either case. You're actually working quite hard. And it's not even really about compensation. Even if you were paid very, very well in an Amazon factory, it doesn't make it any less dehumanizing for you to be treated as an object. It is about, unfortunately, these more ambiguous things: freedom, respect, dignity, significance, meaning. These are feelings. These are abstract, kind of opaque concepts that we have to wrestle with. They are not easily quantifiable in the way that a wage is, for example. Now, the fact that Freire does not define humanity when he talks about humanization, it's a potential issue in this book. What are we fighting for here? Freire doesn't answer that question. The entire book, as you will see, rests on this dichotomy between oppressed and oppressor. And that's why I've spent so much time in this video just generally talking through conceptions of humanity, because Freire tells us that oppression is what happens when an act prevents people from becoming more fully human. So listen, for Freire's argument, it would probably help if he spent more time with this question of what is human, what is fully human, because he's basing everything in this book on this dichotomy that requires oppression, and oppression is removing somebody's humanity, treating them as an object. So what that actually entails does kind of matter, but I do not think that this is fatal for the book in really any way. I'm quite happy to go along with this book with the nebulous idea of what it means to be human, because what it means to be human is a deeply nebulous idea to begin with. And we are spending a lot of time talking about what it means to be human. And yes, this is something that Freire does not spend a lot of time talking about in this book, but this entire book is about humanization, so I'll just say one more thing on this particular topic. And that is that because freedom and respect and dignity and meaning are so unclear and ill-defined, being human and feeling human are incredibly personal things. And because they are such kind of personal and individual things, that is kind of a good way into where Freire starts this book, which is to say that when it comes to liberation, freeing you from the oppressor, humanizing, releasing that bit of humanity that was previously constrained, nobody else can liberate you. You need to be the liberator of yourself. And that's for a very simple reason. And it's because liberation, the process of fighting and working and thinking and acting to liberate yourself, is liberation. I want to underline that point here very firmly, right? Humanity is personal. Our conceptions of human are so nebulous and ever-changing that there is no one condition that we could apply to all of humanity that we could just call liberation. Liberation is struggling and fighting to recognize ourselves as liberated people. This may have some echoes if you've read Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth. You know that Frantz Fanon tells us that violence is often a process of liberation because by taking up arms and fighting oppressors, the oppressed understand themselves as oppressed and as capable of changing their conditions, and that is a necessary requirement for liberation. And this is absolutely crucial to understanding this entire book. If conditions just changed, that would not be liberation. Liberation requires that you change your own conditions. And because of that, Freire has some pretty strong words for oppressors who feel bad for being oppressors. They recognize themselves as oppressors, and they go and give to charity, or they try to help in some way around the margins. Freire calls this false generosity. He says, what you are doing when you do that is you are maintaining the existing power structure, just softening its effects. He writes, discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. Rationalizing his guilt through paternalistic treatment of the oppressed, all the while holding them fast in a position of dependence, will not do. Freire also quotes Hegel here in saying that true solidarity requires fighting alongside the oppressed. But we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like in the context of education as we go through this series. Freire says that bringing down the established order will not seem like liberation to the oppressor. They are so steeped in their world and their values that anything but hierarchy seems like oppression to them. Everything, that is to say, to the oppressor is an object of domination. And that leads Freire to give us one of my absolute favorite lines in this entire book. He says that for the oppressor, to be is to have. To be is to have. Think about that. It was that question that we asked right at the beginning, right? What does it mean to be human? To oppressors, to people with power in a society, being and existence, the very essence of what it means to be alive, to them, the meaning of life itself is stuff. It's having stuff. To be is to have. And with this line, Freire actually does something very cool, because he makes the point, at this point in the book, that because the oppressors have dehumanized the oppressed, because they've done this kind of transformation, they are also dehumanized. They've essentially dehumanized themselves. If they believe that to be is to have, then they no longer are. They only have. Does that kind of make sense? The way that the oppressors have stripped the humanity from the oppressed steeps the oppressors in this mentality where they think existence, the meaning of life, is to have stuff. But that's not the meaning of life. That's kind of the opposite of being human. But they can't see beyond the bounds of that very narrow mindset. For them, to be is to have. But then they will only pursue having stuff. And every time they do that, it takes them further and further away from their own humanity. It dehumanizes them at the same time that they dehumanize the oppressed. And that's why Freire gives us this very powerful line, just literally in the opening pages. I think it's on page 3. I quoted it right at the start of the intro lecture I did last week. This then is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. Because when the oppressed destroy this system, they are not just liberating themselves, they are also liberating their oppressors. They are allowing them finally to be, not just to have. And while we're on this topic of the oppressors, by the way, Freire has some words for the would-be revolutionary. And this should also remind you of Frantz Fanon. If you've read The Wretched of the Earth, it will really help, actually, quite a bit with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Because Frantz Fanon also worried that the revolutionary government that took power after this titanic struggle might look as oppressive as the government that it replaced. And that's because, and ask any anarchist philosopher this, they'll tell you the same thing. Power is a corrosive influence. Power corrupts. And so as soon as you liberate the people and you take power yourself, the very same things that corrupted the government that came before you may begin to corrupt you. And so Fanon talks about the true revolutionary who lives among the people and internalizes their struggles, becomes not just the revolutionary from the outside, but one of the people that they are trying to liberate. And that is exactly what Freire is going to tell us. He doesn't quite get there yet, but he's going to tell us that that is what we need throughout this book. A true, authentic revolutionary who becomes one of the people, who identifies with the people that he is trying to liberate in the first instance. And I actually apologize. I realized I'm following Freire. I'm using very gendered language here. Of course, revolutionaries can be any and all genders. It does not really matter. I don't know. My brain is on Freire's language here, so apologies for that. Anyway, how that happens is a process of investigation. And that process of investigation is something that we'll come to, but Freire has some big ideas about this. The major thing is that the revolutionary can't just come in and start preaching, start trying to kind of liberate from above. Freire says of this inauthentic revolutionary, they talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. So Freire has some strong words for the oppressed and their potentially false generosity. Freire has the words in there for the would-be revolutionary, the revolutionary who seeks to come in and control things and change things from the top down. But Freire also has some words for the oppressed, because he says, listen, dehumanization will lead to struggle. That's inevitable. But the struggle might not lead to humanization. It might actually just lead to further oppression. Why is that? I mean, how could a struggle that resists oppression turn into more oppression? Well, it has to do with what Freire calls the attitude of adhesion to the oppressor. What does that mean? It means if you've grown up and lived your entire life in an oppressive system, you may internalize the values of that oppressive system. Those values are things like ownership, like a drive towards capital, like wealth and power. And so Freire says the oppressed don't initially want liberation, they want stuff. The one pole aspires not to liberation, but to identification with its opposite pole, Freire tells us. And that should make a lot of sense. That when people fight against oppression, they might just fight for power for themselves and not for any kind of necessarily authentic liberation. They just want a little more power. They just want a little more capital, perhaps. And again, we will talk about how Freire envisions getting around this kind of trap of internalizing the image of the oppressor, but the broad strokes of this argument are that what we need to create here is a new type of human, a completely new human being, one that transcends this binary of oppressor and oppressed. Freire says, the solution of this contradiction is born in the labor which brings into the world this new being, no longer oppressor, no longer oppressed, but human in the process of achieving freedom. And that might help us with a kind of deep issue that this book does not wrestle with, that I actually outlined in that intro video last week. It is hard to define oppressor and oppressed. And that's because most of us are both, right? We all kind of sit on this spectrum. It depends on the context. It depends where we are. It depends on the color of our skin. It depends on so many different things. And through our lives, and sometimes moment by moment, we shift between these modes of oppressor and oppressed. It's kind of a natural thing. And this is something that Freire does not wrestle with through this book at all. And it does really complicate this analysis. As we get into Freire's strategies here, right? Sending investigators to a community to investigate, to live among them, to take extensive notes, to come up with generative themes, to identify limit situations, and all of this stuff that Freire is going to explain to us. As we start to think through this, knowing what we know about, as Foucault would say, sources of power are remarkably diffuse, literally identifying communities to bring Freire's methods to, it complicates that. It also complicates how you identify generative themes within a group. It complicates how you even identify what a group is. It complicates a lot of this stuff in this book. But if the overall goal is to bring into being a new kind of human that transcends oppressor and oppressed, then this contradiction does ultimately, potentially, resolve. Maybe. Kind of. It's a little tough, right? Getting there is incredibly difficult. And to be honest, it's something that I continuously wrestle with when I think through Freire's ideas, which I think are utterly brilliant. Like, I think Freire is an absolute genius, and I think that the things that he says in this book are pretty dead on most of the time, but getting through this very practical difficulty of identifying who the oppressed and oppressors are, that can be a little bit difficult to say. But of course, if the end goal is to completely resolve all these contradictions, then maybe it doesn't actually matter all that much. But for now, let's leave these foundations of chapter 1 here. Let me know what you think about any and all of this. Am I misunderstanding something in Freire, do you think, by identifying this as a major potential flaw in his argument? This fact that we can't necessarily pin down who oppressor and oppressed are. What do you think about humanity? What do you think being human means? Is there any way to put down something that might be a little more quantifiable than these nebulous notions of respect and agency and worth and significance? Is there any way to get past that? What can we say? There's been a lot written about this through history, as I say. What do you think in general about Freire? Has this opened your eyes in any respect? I want to hear all of it. Let me know in the comments. Let me know over there on Patreon. Again, that's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. You can also reach out to me directly over there. I'm always happy to hear that. It's always a delight to hear from people. Any and all of this. Tune in next week when we talk about chapter 2. We're getting into the banking model of education. It's going to be really, really cool. I will see you then. Thank you for watching.